Welcome to SAP HANA Cloud Integration. After viewing this video, you will understand several basic ways to modify data flows, including adding a new transform, mapping columns by dragging and dropping, automatically mapping columns by name, and mapping columns through an expression. The examples in this video assume that you have created a new data flow, but the concepts apply to any data flow that you want to edit. By default, the new data flow has only a single transform. The first thing that we'll do in our example is add a new query transform. To do this, change the type of the existing transform from target query to query. Give the transform an appropriate name. Since we plan to use this query transform to illustrate mapping techniques, we'll call it mapping query. Next, we need to replace the target query transform that we just changed into a query. If we don't, we have no way to map columns to the target table. Choose Next to find another transform. The new transform is already a target query, so we can simply give it an appropriate name. We're now ready to start mapping data columns from our source database to the target table. We'll start by returning to the mapping query transform. You can quickly access any transform by clicking on it in the data flow. Before we can map data from columns in the source, we must add it as an input in the mapping query transform. Click Add Input to display a list of the sources available to this transform. Select the sources to use as the inputs for the transform. For this example, we'll use sample sales data stored in the Fact Internet Sales table. The table that we selected now appears in the input section of our query transform. To view the columns, expand the table. The most basic way to map a column is simply by dragging the column from the input section and dropping it onto the output section. We'll use drag and drop to map the product key column to the output of our sample query transform. The product key column now appears in the output section. An icon in both sections indicates that the column is mapped from input to output. You can also map multiple columns at one time by dragging and dropping. Select each column in the input section and then drag them to the output section. We'll use this technique to map the customer key, order quantity, and unit price columns. The three additional columns now appear in the output section as well. Like the product key column, an icon indicates that they are mapped. To quickly show a mapping relationship, you can click on the mapped column. The column is highlighted in both the input section and the output section. Another way of mapping columns is to allow the software to map automatically by column name. Note that automatic mapping by name is available only in target query transforms. For this to work, the column name in the input must match the column name in the output. As a general rule, it's a good idea to do column renaming as early in the data flow as possible. In this example, the order quantity column in the target table has a slightly different name. You can edit a column name in the output section by clicking the edit icon. Depending on the resolution of your display, you may need to adjust the column width to see the edit icon. Adjust a column name is necessary to match the name in your target table. In this case, we know that the column in our target table is named quantity, so we'll change order quantity to that and submit the changes. The new column name is displayed in the output section. We can see from the highlighting that it is still mapped to the same input column, even though the name of the output column has changed. Now, we'll switch to the target query transform to demonstrate automatic mapping by name, and mapping with an expression. Again, we can quickly switch to the correct transform by clicking on it in the data flow. Like in the previous steps, we first need to add columns to the input section of the transform. In addition to data store tables, you can find the outputs from other transforms in the input selection screen. In this case, we want to use the output columns from the mapping query transform. By expanding mapping query, we can see that the 4 columns that we had previously mapped in the mapping query transform are now available as inputs. Notice that some of the column names are the same in both the input and output sections. For example, product key. When this is the case, you can click Auto Map by Name to quickly map all columns that are named the same in both sections. An icon appears next to each column that has been successfully mapped by name. In this case, 3 columns were mapped: product key, customer key, and the quantity column that we had renamed in previous steps. Finally, we'll map one more column. To map a column by an expression, click the column in the Output section, and then enter the expression in the Mapping tab of the Transform Details. For this example, although we do not have a revenue column in the Input section, we can calculate the value by multiplying the quantity and unit price values. In the mapping expression, you can specify the column names by using the table or transform name as displayed in the Input section, then a dot, and then the column name. You can also drag a column directly from the Input section to the Mapping tab. Although this revenue example is quite simple, for more complex mappings, the software supports a number of functions. Information about each function is available by hovering over it in the Mapping tab. After creating the mapping expression, an icon indicates that multiple input columns are used in the mapping of the revenue column. You should now be familiar with several basic methods for modifying data flows in SAP HANA Cloud Integration, including adding new transforms and various ways of mapping columns. For more information about using SAP HANA Cloud Integration, refer to the help within the software and the SAP Help portal. You can also check the Get Started help for FAQs.